Hi everyone, it's Jeanette here from the Sewing Studio with another fun little project. Now this was a little challenge, it was a mission I was set. Jeanette, can you show us how to do some ruffles and then can you make a project? And this was the little project I came up with. So we gave you a little teaser, didn't we? So here it is, actually how to make the little ruffled cosmetic bag. So first things to say, it's actually also a really good scrap buster. So you can sort of see here, I was just using some leftover pieces of fabric and I've even got a different fabric on the back. So, but it doesn't particularly look like a scrap project, and that's what I also love about it. Now my friend Katrina, I'm hoping we can get to this stage where she'll do this sort of zip, but we're getting her there slowly. So my mission is to make people not so afraid of zips, basically. So this isn't too bad, but it's a little bit more complicated than some of our others. Well, it's not complicated, actually. People think it's more complicated, but it still is a flat zip insertion. So let's just dive straight into it. Now I'm going to attach a ruffle to it like we did here, but we've actually filmed a separate video how to do the ruffle just because we didn't want this tutorial to be really long. So if you're not sure how to make ruffles, you can go and have a look. And in that video, I show you sort of 3 different styles of ruffle. But the 2 that I would use specifically for this one are the ones where we've got a folded edge. Now this one we just sort of folded manually. And this is the one that I used on the original project where you sort of sew a stitch in and then you draw it up. Now the rule of thumb for this one is you need twice the length of fabric to get your ruffles back to. Now, to the size you want, sorry, finish that sentence. My project here was 11 inches, so my strip here was 2.5 by 22 inches, I believe. But like I say, go and check that video out because I show you how to make the ruffles in a bit more detail in that one. But today, rather than using the cinched up ruffle, I'm actually gonna use the ruffle that we sort of folded by hand. This one's a little bit easier to do, and I just thought for a different look as well, we'll do that one. So the first step is to make your ruffle. Now this one is a bit more awkward to determine how long you need your strip because it depends on how often you sort of make your pleat, and because we sort of do that just as we go, there's no formula if you like. So I just cut a long strip and then I'll just snip off the bit I need basically. So we need to have made something that's at least 11 inches long. Now let's have a look at these 2 bits of fabric because the front is made up of a little top panel and a bottom panel. And I've got these here. Now this bottom panel is 11 by 6.5, so 11 by 6.5, and this one is 11 by 2 3/4. So I've got my ruffle, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually just tack it to this bottom piece of fabric. So I'm just going to pin it. And on the cinched one, you have to sort of pin quite a lot because it does sort of curl up on you and fight you a little bit more. So we're just going to take our time, and I'm just aligning the raw edge of the ruffle with the top edge of the base. Now, of course, if you've got a directional fabric, it needs to go at the top of the direct, so your direction is, so here's the base, there's the top. So a couple more pins there, and then we're going to take that to the machine and I'm going to sew it with probably about 1/8 of an inch, so almost where I've made the ruffle, the same sort of stitching. And this really is just to attach those 2 pieces together, because what we're going to do in a minute is come back and add that second section, and then we'll sew that on with our 1/4 inch seam. So you just want this to be a tacking stitch, just less than your 1/4 inch seam basically. So let's take all of those 3 bits to the machine. Now I've put my little narrow, this is the single feed walking foot, no, AccuFeed, dual feed, single feed, I believe they call it. I'm not quite sure the technical word, but it's the slimmer of the 2 walking feet that this machine actually comes with. But I use it quite a lot for little projects like this. If you haven't got a narrow one, you can just use your normal walking foot, or your normal foot will do it. But I just find, because there's sort of quite a lot of bulk with the ruffle, if you've got a walking foot, it does help. So that one's on. Now at this point, I'm actually just going to trim away a little bit of that. There's a bit more there than I need. And now we're going to go back in with our top section, and I'm going to do a generous 1/4 inch. Okay, so that's that ruffle put in. Now I'm just going to take that to the iron and give it a press. Now I'm just going to go back and I'm just going to do a little top stitch along there, and all that does is it just helps to keep all of those seams flat and everything nice and together, and as well it just gives it a little bit of a sort of decoration. If you wanted to do that in a coordinated thread, of course you could. Now I'm just taking my stitch length up to about 3.0 just for a top stitch. So let me just bring that in under the close-up so you can see there. We've got a nice little top stitch, so it just makes everything look nice and decorative, but also it's serving that function of actually keeping everything held together, because we've got quite a lot of fabric there with all those pleats and stuff as well. So that's our front made. So I've got a little piece of fusible wadding. Now I believe this is the Blisseline H640, but any sort of, you could even do a scrap piece of wadding from your quilting, or any sort of fusible fleece. And I generally make mine just a little bit smaller than the outside of this. Now let me just trim. Let me just trim that level. And we're just going to fix that with the iron. Now look at these all, if it's a fusible one, they all have slightly different instructions in terms of, you know, whether or not you need to use steam or whether it's a dry iron and the heat of it. So have a look at your product as to what the manufacturer recommends you do on that. So I'm just going to take that to the iron and fix those. But you can see there, I've sort of centered it. Let me just do that on a corner so you can see. I sort of center it so there's a little bit of a gap between the edge of the fleece and the fabric. And the reason for that is to remove some of the bulk from those seams, but to have it big enough that when you do the seam, that fleece is also catching in the seam. So we're not just relying on the fusible element. Now at this point, you could, if you like, quilt it, or you can leave it plain. I think on this one, I've left it plain on the front, but I've quilted the back. So I've done the same on this version. So you can see here, I've just done my diagonal line quilting again, and I've used the quilting guide to do that. I just marked one line somewhere near the centre, stitched that, and then worked off that with the quilting guide. So that's going to be our back. Now I'm just going to line those up and just check they're the right size, and they are. This should, if you do an accurate 1/4 inch, that should come out at 11 by 8 3/4. So that's the size I've made the back. We will of course put all the measurements for everything in the description, so you don't have to rely on memory. So I've had a little tidy up and I've got my lining out. So I've cut 2 pieces of lining that are also 11 by 8 3/4. Now just double check your measurements, because if yours has come out slightly smaller, just, you know, make your back and your linings to fit whatever size your front has come out at. It's a little bag, it's a little craft project, so if it is slightly different size, it really doesn't matter. So that's all prepped now. I've said about the quilting, so we're ready to put the zip in. Now you've got sort of 2 options. You can just put your zip in as it is, or you can make some little fabric tabs to go on the end. Now for simplicity, I'm just going to put the zip in as it is. So we're going to start by deciding how we want our cosmetic bag to open. Generally, if we're right-handed, we go sort of zips from left to right, and left-handed tend to prefer right to left, but it doesn't matter. It's whatever your personal preference is. Now, all you need to make sure with the zip is, what I make sure of is it's slightly longer than it needs to be, and that just means that I don't have to worry too much about the ends, particularly this end here where we have that it's either a hard plastic or a bit of metal, because we don't want our needle to go anywhere near that, because all we're going to do is break a needle if we hit that. So I think this is a 13-inch zip, and that should fit in there lovely. So we've got the top, and we're going to put the zip face down onto that, and I'm just going to put a couple of pins in. But you'll probably notice as soon as I've got it to the machine, I generally take the pins out, because I tend to find if I pin zips, it tends to distort them a bit. Saying that, these fine pins are a lot better. Now the other thing to say is if you're using a zip from a zip on a roll or a zip that's been sort of curled up or just sort of stored in a box and it's a little bit wavy, hit it with the iron first before you put it in, because if it's wavy to begin with, it will go into your project wavy. So that heat on the iron will just flatten it out and you'll get a flatter zip insertion for it. Now I just do that on the hottest setting. The zip will take it as long as you don't sort of keep the iron there for a long time. The nylon coil will take that, and I am using a nylon one, not a hard plastic or a metal zip. They're a lot easier to work with, particularly if you're new to using zips. So we've got that there. We're just going to take our lining and we're going to just put it face down onto there. So in effect, we're making a zip sandwich. And then I'm just going to line up my edges. And I will just pin, only because I'm going to have to move it to the machine. At home, I don't tend to. But we're just aligning all of those raw edges at the top. So there we are. If I can put that under the close-up, you can see there. So we've got the top of the zip, or the outside of the zip, the top of the front panel and the top of the lining. And we're just going to go and sew as close to that zip as we can get. Now we're sewing it in blind. We can't actually see where that zip is, but we can feel it. And if I sort of do that, you might be able to see a little ridge. We can feel where that ridge is. So what I tend to do is just run the edge of my foot and either use a zipper foot, or like I say, I've got the narrow walking foot on, and I'm just going to butt that right up to the edge where that bump is, and that will keep me nice and straight, hopefully, while sewing in that zip. So there we are, that's the first side of our zip in. Now I'm just going to take that to the iron and give it a press, just to help keep everything out of the way when I'm doing the second part. So there it is. We're going to come back and top stitch that in a minute, but we're going to do exactly the same with the second side. So I'm going to lay the zip face down. And this time I'm just making sure that I line the edges of the front of the pouch with the edges of the back. I'm just going to put a couple of extra pins just to keep those together. So there we are, let me just show you what that looks like. So those outside pieces are both facing each other. And then we're going to get our second piece of lining and we're going to put that on top of the lining. Now we're going to do the same again. We're going to take that to the machine and sew along there. So when we open it out, that's what it should look like. It's a bit like a butterfly, isn't it? So let me just take that to the iron and press those, and then I'm going to top stitch along both of those edges. And that just helps to finish everything off, but it serves the purpose of actually keeping the lining in place so the lining doesn't shift as you're opening it and getting trapped in the zip. So that's how that's looking at this stage. So the next bit now is we want to trim everything up. Now quite often when we put the lining will shift a little bit. It doesn't shift so bad if we've used the walking foot, so I tend to just give it a little trim up. So I've started to do that here where I've just trimmed off the edge, and let me put that under the close-up, because top tip, so that you don't whiz your zip head off once you've sort of got rid of the stopper there, is just to put a pin or something there to act as a barrier, so you can't actually just pull that zip head off. And then we're just going to trim the other side. But remember to pull your zip head in. That's very important, otherwise we'll have a zip with no means of opening or closing. Now if you just need to trim up everything square, which here I do a little bit, that's absolutely fine. Now I don't tend to go through the zip with my rotary cutter because it blunts your blade, so I tend to just scissor cut that little bit. And because it's a nylon zip, we can do that. There we are, that's all that needs to come off there. But that's just squared everything up and made it much easier for us to put that together. Now the other thing you can do here is, and quite often what I'll do is just sort of use a clip to hold that together, but once again that will stop us actually pulling that zip head right off the zip teeth. So now we're going to box our corners. So I'm going to, now you can do all these layers together, but I tend to do them individually. I think it's a little bit more accurate. So we just want to get a marking tool. Now I'm going to make mine 1 3/4. You can make these however big you want, but the rule of thumb is however big you make it, that will be the size of the base of your bag. So I think on that one, I might have done 1.5 inches on this one, but I'm going to do 1 3/4 on this one and call it good. So I'm just going to draw a little box with my pen on the 2 outside pieces and the 2 lining pieces. Now you could do this bit before you sew it together, it really doesn't matter. And then I'm just going to scissor that one out. You can see I've moved those lining pieces out the way. Right, so now we're ready for final assembly. So we're going to put lining pieces together. And then the outside pieces together. And I'm just going to make sure that ruffle is nice and flat. Just double check it on that side, yeah. Now we're going to take this and sew. Now I'm actually going to sort of treat it almost like two pieces. So I'm going to sew the outside bit first and then we'll tackle the lining. And I'm just going to go from the zip down both sides and along the bottom, but not those corners for a minute. We need to box those, so we need to treat them slightly differently. So let's start by doing that. I'm just going to show you what I'm doing there with the zip. Now you can see I've just removed that pin that was stopping us from pulling the zip head off. And you can see there I've got the teeth of the coil of the zip on top of each other. And I'm just going to sort of fold that. And then I'm just going to use my clip to hold all of that together. But I'm actually going to just start a little way back and then come back, go back to it and then come forward, because that clip's going to get in the way a little bit, but we need it to hold there for a minute. Right, now I can remove it. Now I didn't bother reversing because in a minute we're going to do another seam across that will hold it. So now with our corners, we want to pull them apart this way. And this is what makes the shape. And I'm going to press that bottom seam in one direction and the side seam in another. And then we can nest those nicely there. And then I'm going to sew across there. And we do the same with the other side. So now we're going to do exactly the same with the lining, but I'm going to leave a gap on one of the sides, which we're going to turn it through. And I tend to leave about sort of a hand's width. Okay, so at this point, that's what that should look like. So we've got our nice boxed corners there. And I'll just go and sort of tidy anything up that needs tidying up. And then we should be able to put our hand in. Now the zip was open, I should have said. I've opened my zip, so I should be able to get my hand into that bottom of the bag. Now I tend to go for one of the sort of far corners. At this point, we should just be able to turn things through. Now I'm just going to turn it through and just check that I've caught everything and make sure I'm happy. And I tend to do that before I sort of start trimming any corners or anything, because it's a bit harder to make any adjustments. But just take your time on this bit. So there it is, all finished. Now all I did was just went round all the seams and just checked that I'd caught everything anywhere. I didn't have any holes or any gaps or anything poking through that shouldn't be there. And then I've just gone back on the machine and just stitched up that little gap, just close to the edge, just to hold that. You could, of course, hand stitch that if you prefer. But there it is, our lovely little cosmetic bag. It's not too complicated zip insertion. It goes in sort of quite nicely and it's nice and roomy. Now on this one, let me just bring this one in. You can see here I've added a little fabric yo-yo just for a bit of added detail with a button, and I've actually made another fabric yo-yo for this one. And we've got a separate tutorial on how to do that, and I actually use the Clover Quick yo-yo maker. That makes those really fun and really easy, so you can sort of have it with or without, but I'll probably find a nice button that matches with that and I'll stitch that on as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. Like I say, there's a couple of tutorials that accompany this, one to make the different ruffles and one to do the yo-yos. But hopefully I've given you some nice inspiration for a cute little bag, which makes an ideal gift. Just the one final thing to say is I've made this one slightly deeper. This is 1 3/4 inches. And if I just put them side by side, you can see. So this one was 1.5 inches and this one was 1 3/4 inches. So that just gives sort of more base to your bag, if you like. So you can sort of choose which version, but even if you wanted a wider base, you just increase those sizes of those boxes. Just cut out the squares, all the same on each of your pieces, and you're good to go. So I hope you enjoyed that little ruffled project. I had so much fun making these, and as I said, you know, it's another way of using up some of our leftover bits of fabric to make something absolutely beautiful and a wonderful gift for somebody, or to keep for yourself. So if you give these a go, please do share your photos with us on Instagram and Facebook, or you can email them directly to us here as well. So thank you for spending some time with us here today, and I hope you'll join us again here next time in the Sewing Studio.